In the last episode, we explored Rome's self-portrayal in its art and ideology as one of eternal triumph. Through the eyes of the goddess Victoria, we saw Rome present a triumphant vision of itself. We also saw that perpetual victory was, by necessity, predicated on being perpetually at war. War brought the requisite success that allowed triumphing generals and eventually emperors to parade their successes to a cheering public, fueling the ideology of Rome's endless victory. We saw that victory justified power and domination by displaying it as proof that the gods were on Rome's side. And we saw that in a very real and deep-set manner, Victoria characterized Roman society's sense of place and purpose in the world. Her divine presence articulated the triumphalist aspects of Roman religion. But what about war itself? Where and how does the reality of war fit into this victorious theology? If Victoria was the manifest force of the outcome of war, what deity presided over its initiation and the bloody fact of combat? Who was Rome's deity of war? Mars, very likely, comes to mind. And indeed, Mars was Rome's god of war, and as we noted in the last episode, he was considered, through his fathering of Romulus, the father of the whole populace at large. So Rome was a martial society, quite literally, with the word martial, meaning warlike, deriving its origin from Mars, the god of war. But, as you already knew when you clicked this video, this episode is not about Mars, nor, in fact, is it about a god of war at all, but a goddess named Bellona. And we'll get to her in just a moment, but before we go any further, I want to mention a comment that came last week in response to the episode about Victoria. Somebody commented that they wanted to add that in all of its victories, Rome sacrificed a large proportion of its youth, and as time went on and recruits came from further afield, a lot of men from across the empire died in the name of Rome's victories. I agreed wholeheartedly with this, and I replied something like, absolutely, 100%. A great many very ugly things were done in the name of victory, none of which were advertised in Rome's triumphalist ideology and iconography. And then the comment and my response to it then disappeared, and I'm not sure why, but I thought it was a good point worth making, especially for people who may only randomly have clicked on the video, or for people who have only joined us recently without watching the first video in the series, where I explain what we're trying to do here. Without those points of reference, it might seem like I was holding Rome's conquests and victories up as honest and good, or repeating its rhetoric of victory uncritically. Anyone who's been with us a while, however, knows that what we're doing in this series is rescuing Rome's own gods and its religion from obscurity and a kind of deep-set forgetting that's arisen either from the storyless nature of many of these gods, who have fallen by the wayside of our enjoyment of stories and narratives and mythologies, or else who have disappeared from view due to being eclipsed by the gods of the Greek pantheon, or, as so often happens, being conflated with them. So what we're doing is repopulating the streets of Rome with its own gods and its own way of seeing them, understanding them, and interacting with them. And so when we were talking about the goddess Victoria, we were doing so through the Roman frame to understand her on her own Roman terms, which were, of course, radiant. So thank you to that viewer who took the time to make that comment. I don't know why he deleted it, but it was definitely worth saying. And so let me just state for the record here, for anyone who's just joined us, our aim here ultimately is to push back against that ridiculous but widespread and often repeated statement that Rome only borrowed or stole its religion from Greece. And I hope we're already some way on the path to showing what a bereft and incorrect vision that really is. But by the end of this series, you'll have a full and lively vision of Rome's rich, vibrant, and peculiar religious landscape, as well as a nuanced and accurate understanding of its historical reality. And with that said, let's return to Bellona, a goddess who is very much in the shadows I've just described, and to some extent a goddess who does confront us with the ugly side of war. She's the second in a trilogy of goddesses we'll look at to explore the religious aspects of Rome and her warlike nature. But I wonder how familiar her name is to you. I wonder if you've heard of Bellona much, if ever. It's strange that she should have fallen into such obscurity, because the very fact that Rome was, by its own propaganda, a warlike and military state, means that its gods of war were central and fundamental to the way it thought about and conducted itself. And certainly no Roman was unaware of Bellona and all she stood for. But somehow she too has fallen into the slipstreams of history. So it is that I wouldn't be surprised if you were surprised to hear not only that Rome had a goddess of war, but to learn that she was, moreover, extremely prominent and important both militarily and politically. We're going to tell her story today, and by the end of this episode, I think she'll take up a permanent place in the way you imagine Rome's religious landscape, wherever war is concerned. But perhaps you're wondering about Mars. With such a mighty and well-known Olympian already present, and with a god of war already representing the divine ancestor of the Roman populace, it would be reasonable to wonder whether a goddess of war wasn't just overkill. Excuse the pun. So there are a couple of things to say about Mars. As you may already know, Mars wasn't really the Roman counterpart to the Greek god of war Ares. They were both war deities, but they had quite different characters, and this could be a whole episode in itself. While Ares was a dangerous, belligerent, and consummately warlike deity, Mars had his origins in agriculture, and his cult was embedded in the civic and agricultural rhythms of Roman life. Mars was, in other words, an old local god with a very local flavour. Secondly, if agriculture seems at odds with war and something like its antithesis, that's right and very much the point. You only have to think of the old Roman ideal of the farmer-soldier. Until the brink of the 1st century, farmers were the mainstay of the Roman army. You couldn't even enlist to fight if you didn't own Roman land and have something to fight for. That was the rationale. There was no standing army at that point, and no non-citizen recruits. The robust, rustic ideal was of the good upstanding citizen who laid down his plough and picked up his sword when his country needed him, and then, when the battle was won, who put his sword back down again, and the soldier became an honest farmer once more. That was the image Roman society held on a pedestal, and you can see how the stability and freedom to farm your land came in this way, through arms. So in that light, there's nothing very strange about the Roman god of war being also a god of agriculture and a protector of the community. These ideas, however, operate on a very different register to Rome's martial goddess, who embodied a very different modality of war and who represents a different tone, function, and ritual deployment to the virtuous, orderly, masculine discipline of Mars. In some respects, it's Bellona who is more like the Greek Ares, who delights in war. Bellona was blood-soaked and bloodthirsty. She was the spirit of the battlefield, the embodiment of war itself. She was Rome's blood-stained deity of combat. She was the berserker, the battle frenzy, the clash of weapons and the shrieking power of the warrior unleashed. She was therefore a very different, but also very necessary deity for an empire in an almost perpetual state of war. So listen out for her battle cry now, and let us enter the realm of Bellona. We start with a cup. If you were in Paris wandering through the splendours of the Louvre, you might miss this humble little thing, but it's a very special artefact. It's known as the Balolai Pokolum, the cup of Bellona, and that's what you can see written on it, painted in red glaze. This cup dates to the early 3rd century BCE, and it was found in the region around Rome, and it's important for a number of reasons. It's the first attestation of the name Bellona in the historical record, and it's also a very early written attestation of Latin. But apart from that, and quite splendidly, it has in the roundel, in the centre of the cup, an image of Bellona herself. This is not just the earliest image of the goddess that we have, it's also one of the only images that we have. It's been noted that the style is quite Hellenic, and some people think that there may be Greek influences in the style of this portrait, but what's important is that what it represents is very local. The name is unique from the Italian peninsula and has no resemblance or relationship to any Greek deity. So here, miraculously, you may look upon the face of Bellona peering out at us across the centuries, scowling slightly. Who knows how long she had percolated through the more aggressive and turbulent side of society before this image? Who knows how long and in what form she had been worshipped prior to this? But from the murky recesses of history, she emerges here in human form with dishevelled hair, an indication of her wild spirit and her proclivity towards action and frenzy. And her stern expression reminds us that the domain of this goddess is a serious one, and within it, she is a presence to be reckoned with. Her very name derives from war. Bellum is war in Latin. This is where we derive English words like bellicose, meaning aggressive and fighty, and belligerent, meaning hostile and warlike. Ancient authors also recognized an older name of the goddess, Duellona, which the Roman scholar Varro claimed likewise derived from duellum, also meaning war. So her name doubly signals war. She's knee-deep in the battlefield. When the poet Virgil described the decoration on the shield of the hero Aeneas, he described a mythologized vision of war in which Bellona follows on the heel of the personification of discord. Virgil wrote, Mars rages in the centre of the battle, engraved in steel, with the grim furies in the sky, and discord in a ripped robe strides exuberantly, while Bellona follows with her blood-drenched whip. Here we find Bellona rampaging on the battlefield, cracking a bloody whip. Another ancient writer describes her striding into battle with her armour clanking and clashing as she stomps. Sometimes she's described lunging into the fray, brandishing a frightful spear or a blood-stained firebrand. In sieges, she's described beating at the trembling gates. There are repeated mentions of her bloody hand or her gory hand, and she can even be found storming out at sea. When there are naval wars to fight, she's described as joining ships in battle on the sea. Over and over again, ancient descriptions depict Bellona surrounded by terrible noise. The din of war follows her. She's a really ferocious goddess, and so far removed from all those whining, dining Olympians on their ambrosial heights, or even the solemn majesty of Rome's Capitoline Hill. Bellona is raging and always in the thick of it. The poet Silas Italicus describes her memorably in a particularly savage moment of the Punic Wars against Carthage. He writes, Bellona herself moved through the centre of the battle, brandishing her torch, and her fair hair was spattered with abundant gore. The hoarse cry that came from the dark breast of the hellish goddess was fraught with death, and the dreadful trumpet with its mournful music drove maddened hearts into the fray. Silas Italicus really captures the battle frenzy that Bellona represents here. She's at the heart of the action and that awful image of the reality of hand-to-hand combat. The berserker on the battlefield has a chaotic lack of restraint. There's a kind of madness to this sort of frenzy. The poet Horace used it to metaphoric effect, describing societal madness in its many forms. He railed, "Where there is perverse folly, there is the height of madness. The man who is a criminal will also be a maniac. He who is caught by the glitter of fame has thundering all about his head Bellona, who delights in gore." In describing the legendary battle that erupts at the wedding of Perseus and Andromeda, Ovid even describes her as guilty of sacrilege and defiling the household gods with spilled blood. If you were with us for episode 7, these are the Penates who we saw were central and sacred to home and hearth. There was, in general, a kind of horror about coming to an altar sullied with blood. You had to be ritually clean, and sacrificial blood was always spilled with careful ritual prescription. So to pollute the household gods in this way is utterly outrageous. Ovid writes, "Bellona, in a sea of blood, has drenched the Penates," those household gods, "and polluted by these deeds, she endeavours to renew the strife." We really get the sense that this goddess embodied and presided over war at its worst and its grittiest. So how does this translate into the world of religious belief and practice? How do we situate this battle-frenzied goddess in an orderly, civic religious landscape? Well, she had a few places dedicated to her in Rome, but by far the most important and most prominent was the temple to Bellona Victrix. That's Bellona the Victorious. And yes, you're right if you guessed it, that's the blood-bespattered goddess of war, linking arms ideologically with Victoria, the lovely, shining, winged goddess of victory. Despite their very different characters and demeanours, we can see in the context of Rome's vision of triumph, of course, war and victory do go hand in hand, and the force and frenzy of Bellona was, in the end, the path that led to Victoria. There's a lot of ideology, therefore, packed into that tidy name, Bellona Victrix. But there's a lot more to this in the way that it plays out in her temple. The temple sat just outside the Pomerium, the sacred walls of Rome. Now, being this kind of wild banshee character, it makes a lot of sense to keep Bellona on the outside of the walls, but this location also served a very practical and very useful purpose. It stood just outside the old Servian walls on the east side of the Via Triumphalis, in other words, the Triumphal Way. When victorious generals and their troops returned from the battlefield, this is the route by which the triumphal parade would enter the city. So you can already see how this would be a key location for returning troops. However, generals had to give up their arms at the city gates, and also their imperium, which was the power they wielded outside of Rome when they waged war, and they had to meet with the Senate and petition for the right to enter the city in triumph. This would be deliberated carefully, and all of this took time to organize. So the process, which had to be conducted outside the city walls, took place in this temple to Bellona. And here, all the great military commanders of Roman history, Scipio, Marius, Pompey, Caesar, you name it, they all presented their case ad Bellonam, before Bellona. And the Senate voted on granting a triumph before the altar of the goddess. Imagine then how it felt to stand in that temple, between the memories and those walls, lining up, as it were, to join in triumph the long procession of Rome's celebrated war heroes of the past who had triumphed before you. Imagine the sense of momentous history that must have surrounded you in that temple's hallowed sanctuary. Sitting in a kind of limbo between inside and outside, war and peace, battle and triumph, Bellona offered a liminal space for fate and fame to be sealed. anything to do with the business of war was conducted here. Its liminality, officially just outside of Rome, made it a convenient diplomatic location. Foreign ambassadors and envoys could be met and heard by the Senate here without admitting them into the city, and accordingly, declarations of war could be made here and treaties could be signed here. So this is, in fact, where many of Rome's great wars began and ended. And you can imagine how intimidatingly the echoes of history must have redounded in that space to all who were called there and all who carried out their affairs there. We've actually encountered this temple briefly once before in this series for its role in declarations of war. If you can remember back to episode 3 about the god Terminus, who was concerned with boundary stones and sacred boundaries, we saw that there were rituals called fetial rituals, conducted by fetiales, priests who were responsible for declaring war and making treaties, ensuring that such actions were divinely sanctioned. And in these rituals we saw that the Pater Patratus, who was the chief priest, would carry a blood-smeared spear, and upon reaching the enemy's territory he would hurl it across the border, symbolizing the official declaration of war. However, we also saw that as the empire expanded, when Rome had to declare war on ever more distant territories, the ritual was adapted so that the priests themselves didn't have to walk absurdly long distances in order to declare war. A soldier of a foreign enemy was therefore forced to buy a small plot of land, which was therefore technically enemy territory. A column, known as the Columna Bellica, was erected there, and from that point on the bloody spear was ritually thrown over this column as a proxy to officially signify the declaration of war on enemy territory. So this land was located in front of the Temple of Bellona, and now you can see that the blood on the spear and the blood of war that it invoked were well located at the temple to the sanguine goddess of war. The temple itself had been vowed to Bellona in the heat of battle. It was vowed by the general Appius Claudius Caecus in 296 BCE during the Third Samnite War. In other words, around the same time as the Bellolae Poculum that I showed you, that cup of Bellona. And Livy not only recounts the circumstances of the battle, but even the very prayer that Appius Claudius was heard to have offered. The battle had gotten off to a bit of a shaky start, but Appius Claudius lifted up his hands to the heavens so that everyone on the front lines and around the legionary standards could see it, and he uttered this prayer. Bellona, if thou wilt grant us victory today, I, in return, vow a temple to thee. After this prayer, Livy tells us, it seemed as though the goddess really had indeed inspired him. He was so full of valour and displayed a courage which Livy says was equal to his colleagues, or indeed to that of the whole army. They won the battle, and the temple was duly built and dedicated upon his victorious return to Rome. Later, Appius Claudius is even said to have set up his family's ancestral shields in Bellona's temple, seemingly in an attempt to link his family and his legacy to the temple and the glories to follow. But other generals also linked their fortunes to Bellona. Most notably, the general turned dictator Sulla, who led the first Roman army against Rome in civil war. Sulla developed a particular soft spot for Bellona. She became a personal mascot for him and even appeared to him in dreams. Following his decisive victory over his longtime enemy Marius at the Battle of the Colline Gate in 82 BCE, Sulla convened the trembling Senate at the Temple of Bellona with the intention of intimidating them into submission. As they sat and listened to his thinly veiled threats and instructions on how they were to behave, he had timed the meeting so that 6,000 prisoners captured after the battle were executed just outside in the Villa Publica as he talked. Their cries and screams were fully audible to the senators in the temple, and when their fear and discomfort betrayed their faces, Sulla calmly assured them not to worry. Those noises? Oh, those are just some traitors meeting their fate. Now, what was I saying about my plans? It was political theatre of the bloodiest kind, and in the temple to Bellona, it was a display well suited to the venue. No cult statues of Bellona exist, so we're left to imagine how she appeared in her most civic and subdued contexts. Presumably in statues, she took on an austere but martial appearance, but there was always something untamable and distinctly other about her in the pantheon. She's often compared to the Greek goddess Enyo, which just bores my brains out because apart from the fact that Enyo is a war goddess, they really have nothing much in common, and the comparison is dull. So just reapply here those arguments I've given you for other Roman deities, and let's not rehash them. The comparison just flattens out all the Roman origins, historical flavour, and cultural importance. And so to say that Bellona is the Roman version of Greek Enyo, it's just a thought-terminating truism. It's boring. What isn't boring, though, is the comparison, and to some degree the conflation of Bellona to an Eastern goddess called Ma. So during his battles in the east against King Mithridates of Pontus, the dictator Sulla, who we were just talking about, was introduced to the local Anatolian warrior goddess Ma, and he clearly understood her to be the local incarnation of his beloved Bellona. Moreover, some aspects of the Eastern worship of Ma, at some point, if not this point, found their way back to Rome. Now, Eastern cults had been in Rome for some time. The cult of Anatolia and Kybele, the Magna Mater, from what is now Turkey, had been officially introduced to Rome during the Second Punic War in the late 3rd century. That was a well-respected cult in Rome, but in its importation, some of the more Eastern habits of her worship had to go. The same was true of other Eastern religious habits that drifted west. The Romans, as a rule, weren't great fans of orgiastic ceremonials with ecstatic revelry and people flailing about too much with cymbals and flamboyant abandon, and they had a total horror of eunuch priests. So these things were toned down, but still, the Oriental elements that remained of various cult worship were conspicuously different from Roman habits, and some of these seem to have accrued to Bellona via this Anatolian goddess Ma. Bellona's priests, the Bellonarii, engaged in ritual bloodletting and self-mutilation, which is certainly in keeping with the goddess as we've encountered her in this episode, but perhaps it seems quite out of keeping with the rest of Roman religion as we've encountered it generally. But do you remember Veiovis or Vediovis from episode 5, who had hints of human sacrifice loitering about him? We said that these hints, whether collective memories or collective imaginings, bubbled up from time to time in Roman religion and are always glossed over quickly. Well, this is one of those places. The blood let by Bellona's priests and self-sacrifice have more than a hint of human sacrifice about them. And it's not much of a stretch to understand why a goddess of war might demand human blood. There's also one really odd mention by the ancient historian Dio Cassius of an incident in the city where some other demolitions were going on that accidentally also destroyed a shrine of Bellona. In it, Dio nonchalantly remarks, were found jars of human flesh. He then continues his story without further detail on this matter, so make of that what you will, whether an urban myth, a misinterpretation of the contents of the jars, or indeed some sort of human remnants. But anyway, Dio doesn't seem to think it needs further elaboration, and perhaps to a Roman audience there was something not altogether surprising about the idea in relation to Bellona, whether it was true or not. At any rate, Bellona's festival day fell at the end of a week of Eastern, Phrygian-style ecstatic rites associated with the Eastern deities Cybele and Attis. Not coincidentally, on a day known as the Dies Sanguinis, the Day of Blood. Ancient writers depict this as a day of wild and orgiastic ritual violence. The priests of Cybele conducted ritual self-flagellation, whipping themselves until they bled, and this was also the day new priests were supposed to have been castrated. So this seems a fitting day for Bellona to join in the festivities. Her acolytes cut their own limbs, and the sources are unclear, but it seems that they either had to offer the blood and sacrifice or drink it themselves, which might make you wonder about the purpose of that cup of Bellona that I showed you at the start of this video. The bloodletting was supposed to inspire the worshippers into a warlike frenzy to please the goddess. In an epigram, the satirist Martial explains why he gets out of Rome as often as he can and runs off to his country house, and he gives all the noise and commotion of the city as his reason. Among the things he lists that makes too much noise, he includes what he calls the fanatic rabble of Bellona, which he complains does not cease from its clamour. This is, of course, satiric exaggeration, but it does paint a funny picture of an unamused Roman aristocrat getting irritated at these crazed fans of Bellona dripping blood all over the place and making too much noise. So finally, the first emperor Augustus made some religious reforms that quite purposely sidelined Bellona and pushed her out of the limelight. With the age of emperors, individual citizens were no longer granted triumphs. All the military glory now fell on the emperor. So Augustus built up the area around the Temple of Bellona with all sorts of Augustan monuments, including a whacking great theatre for his nephew Marcellus and a portico to his sister Octavia. These additions to the urban landscape crowded out the temple to Bellona somewhat, and also forced a change to the ancestral triumphal route so that it didn't pass by Bellona anymore. Rearranging the dynamics of power in Rome, Augustus erected a temple to Mars Ultor, that's Mars the Avenger, in the heart of his new forum in the city. This was to be the new focal point of matters of war in the centre of Rome. The new temple was connected to the imperial household and pointedly disconnected from all the triumphing war heroes of the city's past. Imperial war matters were now firmly recentered with the emperor and stately Mars. But Bellona continued to receive her dues, and it was her noisy fanatics 100 years later that were still keeping Martial awake at night. So if you ever find yourself in Rome, walking by the Carmental Gate and headed down to that splendidly preserved section of the ancient city, from the theatre of Marcellus to the portico of Octavia, where you really get a sense of walking down the sweep of the ancient street with its grand Augustan architecture and all those columns and arches, take a moment to stop before you turn right at the theatre and pause at the unassuming grassy knoll there, covered in random bits of rubble. This is the Forum Holitorium, the ancient vegetable market, and that raised mound in front of you, that's the podium of the temple to Bellona Victrix, and those few fallen bricks and those chipped bits of columns are all that remains of that once great building where all Rome's most famous and most powerful generals have stood before their triumphant entrance into the city, where wars were declared and wars were concluded, and where that blood-stained goddess of war was housed from battle cry to death throes, always shrieking for Rome and victory.